0519 hours. Open ocean. The radar picture changes before anyone on the bridge says a word about it. 3 surface contacts appear at nearly the same moment, spaced wide across the tactical display, each on its own converging bearing. The spacing is deliberate. Not the clustering of ships that happen to share a patrol area, but the geometry of ships that have been assigned positions relative to each other and to something else. That something else is the carrier. Speed increasing. Below decks, systems shift from routine monitoring to active tracking without any announcement driving the transition. Status indicators change color. Consoles brighten. The ship does not accelerate. It does not turn. It registers the new information and holds its posture, because the first principle of encounters like this one is that sudden motion produces ambiguity, and ambiguity gives the other side options it would not otherwise have. Multiple contacts closing. No AIS. No radio traffic. Long-range optics sharpen the returns into silhouettes, angular hulls, tall mast profiles, the distinctive wake geometry of military vessels being driven at speed rather than cruised. These are not fishing vessels that wandered into the area and not merchant traffic cutting across a shipping lane. The flag identification confirms what the hull shapes already suggested: Russian warships. 3 of them. No hail on any frequency. No explanation for the bearing. No signal that could be characterized as anything other than deliberate positioning relative to a carrier that they have known about for long enough to have planned this approach before it began. Condition 3. Key stations man up. Not for engagement, for readiness. The distinction is important, and everyone who receives the order understands it. In the Combat Information Center, each contact receives a track designation and a color code. Their projected courses are overlaid, and the geometry describes an intent that no individual ship's bearing would communicate alone. One vessel angles toward the carrier's port quarter. A second approaches from starboard. The third holds slightly astern, maintaining speed and angle consistent with a position designed to close the rear if the carrier turns in either direction. Not an encirclement yet. The shape of one. The captain studies the plot without leaning toward it. He does not raise his voice. He says nothing that is not operationally necessary. The crew does not need narration. They can read a tactical display. The carrier holds its heading. That decision carries as much content as any order. A course change would be a response, and a response confirms that the approach is producing its intended effect. Holding the line removes that confirmation entirely and shifts every subsequent Russian decision into a space where they must account for their own behavior without the cover of reacting to American behavior. Distance closes. The contacts resolve more clearly through the optics. Deck features, sensor array configurations, crew visible at stations. Gun mounts present, not manned. Missile hatches closed. The posture is precisely calibrated. Pressure without a specific provocation that could be pointed to. Presence without an action that crosses a documented threshold. This is how maritime pressure is designed to work. You do not block a ship outright. You occupy the space that the ship would need if it chose to exercise its options. You make every potential maneuver marginally more costly than staying on course. You shrink the geometry until the carrier's captain must make a choice between yielding sea room and accepting the discomfort of close proximity to 3 warships that will not explain themselves on the radio. The carrier does not yield sea room. Electronic support measures run continuously in passive collection mode, logging every radar emission the 3 Russian ships produce, frequency bands, sweep rates, power levels, pulse repetition intervals. Nothing is jammed. Nothing is challenged. Everything is time-stamped and archived. If this encounter produces a diplomatic exchange in the next 72 hours, the technical record will predate any narrative either side attempts to construct. At 0526, the Russian formation adjusts. The 3 ships stop closing on straight lines and begin to drift laterally. Small course corrections that look like seamanship to anyone not tracking them precisely, but that represent coordinated positioning to anyone who is. The port ship eases to a bearing that places it just outside the carrier's minimum safe maneuvering envelope. The starboard ship mirrors the adjustment. The trailing vessel increases speed slightly to close a gap that opened during the lateral movement, maintaining the rear quadrant position that makes the geometry feel like a box rather than 3 independent ships. The maneuver is practiced. These crews have rehearsed this profile. Maybe not against this specific carrier, maybe not in this specific body of water, but the spacing precision and the coordination timing indicate muscle memory rather than improvisation. Range drops below 10 nautical miles. The tactical coordinator notes the formation type without editorializing. 3-ship coordinated approach, deliberate positioning. No one in the CIC adds anything. The observation is sufficient. The carrier's escorts hold their station, feeding continuously into the shared network. The combined sensor picture available to the American formation extends well beyond what any single ship's radar could produce alone, and well beyond what the Russian commanders on their individual bridges can see of the full defensive architecture they are approaching. They can see one carrier. They are approaching a networked system. Airwing status updates arrive on schedule. Aircraft are briefed and ready. Nothing is launched, nothing is spun up in a way that would be visible from outside the formation. Readiness without display. The absence of visible reaction is itself a form of pressure. It denies the Russian ships the narrative that they are forcing a response. One of the forward Russian ships makes a sharper adjustment, nudging its bow closer to the carrier's projected track. Closest point of approach recalculates, under 4 miles and continuing to decrease. The navigator reports it. The captain watches the number without reacting to it. The ocean between the ships has become narrow in the way that only close proximity encounters at sea can make open water feel narrow. Thousands of tons of steel moving on bearings that the geometry is slowly forcing toward intersection. The sensation is not fear. These are trained professionals, but it is weight. The kind of weight that comes from understanding exactly how little room exists for a misjudged course correction at this range and this speed. The carrier's track remains geometrically clean. Same heading, same speed, every movement predictable to anyone watching it. That predictability is not passivity. It is the mechanism by which the carrier transfers the full burden of the situation onto the ships that created the situation. The Russian commanders must now calculate every subsequent move against a carrier that will not give them a reaction to point at. If this ends in an incident, the record will show 3 ships closing on a carrier that held a straight, documented, clearly established course throughout. At 0534, a subtle shift registers in the Russian formation, not in position, in timing. The trailing ship increases speed a fraction of a knot more than the formation geometry requires. The port ship adjusts heading by a degree more than the previous correction would suggest. The synchronization that produced the precise box geometry begins to carry small errors. Each individual ship is still executing the approach correctly in isolation. The errors emerge in the coordination between them, the intervals between corrections, the slight variations in the angles they are compensating for. Electronic support measures log a change in radar sweep behavior from the lead Russian vessel, not a mode shift, a timing variation. The sweep rate has increased slightly, consistent with a crew that is monitoring its spacing more frequently than it was 10 minutes ago. The carrier continues. The leading Russian ship makes a probe, a nudge of its bow inward, testing whether the carrier will finally break course to preserve clearance. The CPA tightens, then stabilizes, then begins to open as the Russian ship holds the new angle rather than pressing it further. The probe produced no reaction from the carrier. The ship that produced it must now decide whether to press again or accept that the tactic is not generating the effect it was designed to generate. It does not press again. The second Russian ship, observing the probe and its non-result, makes a compensating adjustment to maintain its relative position. The adjustment is a fraction of a second late. The box geometry degrades slightly. Now the trailing ship must accelerate to maintain its astern position, and the acceleration creates a wake geometry inconsistent with the spacing the formation has been holding. The synchronization, once broken in one place, propagates. Inside the CIC, the watch team tracks it without comment. Formation coherence is degrading. That note goes into the log with the same flat precision as every other observation since 0519. The carrier holds. At 0543, the first Russian ship produces a course deviation that the formation cannot absorb cleanly. A fraction of a degree. Nothing that would register as significant on its own. But the timing places it at the worst possible moment for the other 2 ships to compensate simultaneously. One compensates early, one compensates late. The box that had been holding a precise geometric relationship to the carrier for 24 minutes develops a visible seam on the port side. The carrier does not exploit the seam. It does not surge forward through the opening or angle to widen it. It maintains the same course it has held since 0519 because the seam is not an opportunity to take advantage of. It is evidence that the formation has reached the point where maintaining the geometry costs more than the geometry is worth. Exploiting it would reset the clock. Holding through it forces the conclusion. The second Russian ship turns to close the seam. The turn is larger than it needs to be, and it briefly positions the ship at an angle inconsistent with the formation's original design. The third ship, attempting to hold the rear position while the forward two are adjusting, reduces speed and widens its angle. The box is no longer a box. At 0547, the first real withdrawal begins. One Russian ship alters its bearing outward, not dramatically, not in a way that announces retreat, but by enough degrees over enough seconds that the CPA number begins moving in the other direction. The ship has made a decision to release pressure before the geometry forces a more visible retreat. The turn is designed to look like a navigation adjustment rather than a conclusion. The carrier does not react to it. The carrier has been doing nothing that requires reacting to a withdrawal because the carrier has been doing nothing that required doing differently since the contacts first appeared on the scope. The second ship follows. Slower, more measured, a crew that wants the separation without the appearance of having been forced into it. The third, which had been holding the astern position, reduces power and allows the gap behind the carrier to grow at the rate the gap was always going to grow once the forward ships lost their converging angles. The box dissolves degree by degree. The distances widen. The carrier's path ahead clears. On the bridge, the watch officer reports bearings opening, range increasing on all contacts. The captain acknowledges and issues one order: resume standard watch rotation. Not because the situation has been resolved, it has been documented, and documentation is resolution at the strategic level, but because the operational posture that produced the outcome was simply the carrier doing exactly what it was supposed to be doing. The post-encounter record is assembled in the CIC with the same precision that marked the approach. 3 Russian warships executed a coordinated encirclement approach against a carrier strike group over a 28-minute window. The approach employed rehearsed formation geometry, coordinated lateral positioning, and sequential probing maneuvers designed to force the carrier to choose between yielding sea room and accepting sustained close proximity. The carrier held its original course and speed without alteration throughout the encounter. The Russian formation lost geometric coherence at the 24-minute mark. Sequential disengagement followed over the next 4 minutes. No weapons were activated by either side. No communication was exchanged. The record requires nothing added to it. The strategic content of the encounter is in what the Russian approach assumed and what the carrier's response demonstrated about that assumption. The approach assumed that sustained close proximity from 3 coordinated ships would produce a course change, an escalatory response, or a visible behavioral shift that would establish the approach as effective. None of those outcomes occurred. The carrier's predictability denied all 3 simultaneously. A pressure tactic that produces no pressure has revealed the limits of the tactic without providing any operational data about the limits of the target. The Russian formation spent 28 minutes in precise coordination and withdrew, with a record showing that the coordination was executed and that it produced no result. That record will inform the next planning session that considers a similar approach against an American carrier. The ocean ahead of the carrier is open water again. The Russian ships are visible on the horizon, tracking on a parallel course at a distance that no longer constrains anything. Their presence is observation now, not pressure. The carrier continues forward. Same heading it held when the first contact appeared. Wake clean and straight behind it. The ship that holds its line long enough defines where the line is. 3 warships discovered that today in open water, at close range, without a word exchanged between them. If this breakdown gave you a clear picture of how coordinated maritime pressure tactics work and what counters them, subscribe and share it. More of these analyses keep coming as long as you are here for them.